Welcome, welcome, welcome. Help us join us, the Microsoft Graph and Azure Functions, as we marry those two things together. You talked a little bit about before Azure Functions. You saw how those work. Now it's time to actually see how you can become productive. And Dimitri and I today, I'm Louis Maresca. We're going to go through a lot of this stuff and how we can marry those two things together and become really productive. So let's go do story time now. What's one of the hardest things you can do today when you're actually building out a service? Well, one thing is I need to figure out where I'm going to get the data. How am I going to get the data? All these different heterogeneous endpoints that I need to get data from. I need to figure out how to do that, how I'm going to aggregate it all together, write business logic around it. But then also, where am I going to host this thing? Where am I going to put it out there? How am I going to integrate it together? How am I going to scale it? These are things that are very hard and complex to do today, and even when you're using cloud services and VMs to figure it out. So when I entered the business, I got to cut the advantage of really kind of doing very simple utilities, simple use services. I didn't really have to build out. I had a really kind of a local audience more than a kind of a global, scalable audience. And so I didn't really have to figure out how to do all of these things. But as I kind of moved across in different companies and different jobs, I got the opportunity to build bigger and better things. And even when I met Dimitri, we got this kind of idea, the ability to kind of essentially build bigger services where we had to figure things out, like how are we going to get the data for our services? How are we going to scale it out? What services and machines are we going to put it on? How are we going to integrate them together? And we want to really show you how to get there and how to make it easier, because one of the things that we had a problem with years ago is that we had a customer come in, or a person come in and say, hey, we want you to build this really kind of scalable system for us. We want the ability for our sales force to really be productive and be communicative across the band and be able to talk to our customers and be to integrate with our customers. And the only way for them to do that is to be signaled, and whether from their correspondence that's coming into to the service, whether they're sending an email about a particular account or their sale. They want to make sure the entire sales team and sales force was in sync and alerted. And really the only way to do that is to really build a scalable service to do it. So Dimitri and I kind of got to work, and we first started with a prototype. We started out with one single box, whether either was hosted, it was in a data center. We built this very simple service that allowed us to essentially call into an email service. We had to find the endpoint for that. We called in there. We got the data for the particular email for every mailbox that we wanted to track. And then we pulled the emails in. And then from there, we were able to extract a little bit of information about the sender. And then from there, we were able, then called the third-party service. And so we kind of figured out what the business logic was. But we didn't really have to deal with the scalability side of things. So that was kind of the key, is we kind of stayed very simple when we were experimenting, we were architecting it. But then we found out that this wasn't going to scale. And what we noticed is, in reality, we were going to have to scale it out. So then we started scaling it to multiple different machines. We actually created a cron service, or a polling service, that periodically woke up and checked different mailboxes for data. And again, that's kind of difficult to scale, because more mailboxes come in, the more email comes in, the more you have to actually scale the service. And so that becomes a very difficult way to actually architect the system. In reality, what ended up coming up was, this is kind of what the design we had, the architecture we had. So we had to start to scale out the service even more, because now, the more email boxes that we were managing, the more customers that were writing in, and the more backend that we had to store the data. We had to talk to our third-party system around whether the contacts were being tracked or not. And again, we had to talk to the email server and bring that data in. And again, we periodically woke up, and so that's not a deterministic thing to be able to wake up so often. The more email you get, the more times you have to wake up, the longer time it takes to compute and process. And again, it's very hard to figure out that scale factor, that the algorithm for scaling out. And again, we were doing this all on physical hardware. So, this is me. I'm a little older, a little wiser. Dimitri didn't get old. He's still young and at age, but I think for me, I got older. And he got wiser in the same sense, but I had to get a little older. And for me, now they have better technologies. We have better ways to do this, where we can essentially merge things together. We have the graph, and Dimitri's going to talk a lot about the graph today, where we essentially have one single place, one single endpoint for us to go to pull that data that we need, the really rich set of data, the relationships that we have with that data. And not only do I have to get, if I wanted data for my email, my contacts, my appointments, everything comes from a single endpoint. And then we can bring that into a rich compute zone, a serverless technology, Azure Functions, and allows us to trigger off events, allows us to scale based off of when there's traffic, not necessarily having to waste time when I'm doing things like polling and cron functions. Definitely not a really easy way to scale. And I can trigger and do things and do rich business logic and workflows just by kind of marrying those things together. And we're going to get into that. Also, you can always go back to the same architecture as well. We'll talk a little bit about Azure Functions in a little bit. You've already heard about it, but we want to talk about how there's special templates and bindings that deal with the graph, and how you can also still do things like timing functions, and as well as cron functions that kind of spin up and aggregate data and do processing for you. So we're going to talk about the powerfulness of the togetherness of these things. We're going to talk a little bit about how an IT pro scenario, a very simple scenario that could actually be something you could turn into a big workflow, and how those kind of marry together with Graph and Azure Functions. As well as we're going to go a little bit into that sales scenario that we talked about in the beginning, and how we can potentially build out a really great demo, a really great scenario in just a small amount of time, a small amount of code, and not have to really worry about the scalability and where I'm hosting it. So without further ado, Dimitri's going to go with what we have next.
Sure, thanks, Lewis. So today we'll be going over the Microsoft Graph and what you can do with the Graph, Azure Functions and how to use them, and then putting those two technologies together to build really powerful business automation. After that, we'll discuss some of the next steps and where you can go from there. So let's dive into Microsoft Graph. You might be asking, what is the Graph? In short, Microsoft Graph is the API for the Microsoft Cloud. With it, you can access data from across a broad spectrum of Microsoft services: SharePoint, Active Directory, Exchange, and many more. And not only can you access the data, you can see how the data is interconnected. As you can see here, each resource from across these services has different edges to other resources. And you can explore each edge and traverse the graph to pull in rich context. You can do things like give in a user, figure out who their manager is, or groups they're a part of. And you can go beyond just data and relationships, and you can get a sense of what that data and those relationships really mean. With Insights APIs like People, which gives you people relevance based on your communication with individuals in your organization and outside of your organization, as well as Insights, trending insights, which lets you know what files are popular in your org. And Graph supports both work and school, as well as personal accounts, so you can build one application and have it work across all your users. Speaking of which, integration with Graph is really simple. Your app can talk to Graph with either HTTP or with Microsoft Graph SDKs. We have client libraries available for platforms like .NET, Java, Android, JavaScript, TypeScript, PHP, and many more. And instead of talking to each of the underlying services, you can talk to a single endpoint. That gives you a couple benefits. The first is, as your app progresses, you can make additional integrations really simply by just adding new scopes. And with these new scopes, you can make additional calls to new APIs that light up. So it really scales with your application. As your app matures, your app can mature as Graph matures. In addition, by having a consistent API, you can learn the patterns once and reuse them and use your knowledge to make new integrations. So this kind of goes back to spending more time working on your business process and figuring out how do you create value for your business versus learning and understanding how to do auth. We have auth libraries that make it really simple to get started with Graph. We have Microsoft Authentication Library, which is MSAL, and Active Directory Authentication Library, which is ADAL. Both of those make it really simple to get up and running. And then we have SDKs that make it easy to make integrations with Graph and make calls. Overall, you really spend more time working on your business logic than you do getting a sense of how to get started. So to give a kind of a quick look at some of the things you can do, here's a sprinkling of some of the requests you can make. And note that all of these requests are just rooted at me. So this is really not a representative sample of all of what's available in Graph. It's just a small look at what you can do with a single resource. So I can begin by getting the user's information. And me is an alias for the current logged in user. So I get a user profile back. From there, I can append manager to fetch the information about who their manager is. I can fetch their photo, their drive items. I can fetch people that are relevant to them across the org, both internal as well as contacts. I can get teams that they're part of using the Beta API as well as Insights Trending, which gives you popular files in their organization. So one of the tools that makes it really simple to get started is the Microsoft Graph Explorer. So what the Graph Explorer is it's a sandbox that lets you get started and make requests without having to write code. We have pre-canned requests that you can use to have a guided walkthrough of what's available. And we have a sample tenant set up, so you don't have to sign in to get started. Let's open this up and take a look. So here I'm signed into Graph Explorer. Actually, I'm not signed into Graph Explorer, and that's one of the things I want to talk to you. Here, before signing in, I can make requests, and this is against some sample data. So I can fetch the user, and we see that I get back Megan Bowen. And from there, I can make some of those requests I just showed you. So I can say, I want to fetch my manager. And I just append manager, and I fetch another user. And please note that the properties on both of these users are exactly the same. A user is a user. And I can do other things with a given user. I can fetch the groups they're a part of by just querying member of. And I can see all of the groups that they play a role in. One of the other really important things for organizations and building business applications is email. Email is really the lifeblood of a lot of applications in big companies. So I can query my messages by making a simple request, and I can get back all of my email. And you can see here I have the subject line, I have a preview of the body, I even have a flag to tell me if it's been read. And I can do querying over these emails. So I can say, not only do I want these messages, I want specifically messages that I've read. So I can say I want to filter on is read equals true. And I get back a subset of my emails that I've already read. So my app can request data that's really contextual and specific to their use cases versus getting tons of data back and having to filter it themselves. And I can go further, and I can go beyond just whether I read the mail, and I can append whether the mail contains a given string. So for instance, if the subject contains marketing, I want to pull that in. And that's as simple as appending and contains subject and marketing. I run that query, and I can see here, that I have an email that's called evolving our online marketing materials. So I can really request exactly the data I want. Now let's kind of pop back up and see what's available other than the current user. So I can go to groups and query for all the groups available in the org. Let's take one of these groups and just copy out their ID. And let's kind of dive deeper. So by appending this ID to the groups collection, I can query for just that group. And here I see information about what the group is, its email, the configuration of the group, and then I can append members to get back to who's a part of the group. So now I've pulled in the group from both the side of the user, and I've pulled in the user from the side of the groups. So as you can see, you can really traverse these relationships both ways. One of the really cool things groups has is threads. And these conversation threads can be queried by just appending threads. And I get back a pretty good amount of data. So I get back a preview it looks like there's a meeting that's about to be set up, something about higher education. And if I'm really interested in these threads, I can query for all of them. But if I'm building an application that only really needs some of them, for instance, a React app where I only render 3 components at a time, I really need to trim down the information I get back because I can't make use of all of it. I can do that by just appending top and specifying the number of items I want to see. So in this case, I just want the top 3 items. And Graph does that for me. So it gives me back just 3 items. And from there, I can also get a page for the next set of 3 items. So Graph is really smart about giving me that next link.
Dimitri, you're doing this all without even logging in. So this is just a great tool to be able to go out there and test it without any login account.
That's
awesome.
Right. All this data is in the sample tenant. So you can just make these requests, no configuration required, no coding required. Really powerful stuff. Let's jump to some of the intelligence APIs. I think these are really cool and really showcase the power of Graph. So I can type in me, as I did before. Now I can go to people. And as you notice, I'm typing people after me. So this is fetching people in the context of a user. So these are the people that are uniquely relevant to me based on my interactions. So that's emails I've sent, meetings I've been in with other people. All that data gets pushed back as signals to give me ranking of who's most relevant to me. So as I scroll through this, I can see that each user or each person has a relevance score. And I can sort these people and build really smart business solutions like smart people pickers that have the most likely people you're going to contact show up first. The other intelligence API I want to showcase is on the beta endpoint, and it's called Insights Trending. And this is an API that gives you back what files are most popular in your organization. And you can use this to power really intelligent business applications that show you what's most popular and can really make use of the files that your users think are important and relevant. You can leverage that for your own use. Some of the really cool APIs are available on beta. One of the really interesting ones requires me to sign in, so I'll do that with my personal account. And this one is called Project Roam, and this is a Windows API that makes it simple to query the devices I'm signed into and send requests to those devices. So as I sign in, this is a personal account, so this is not a work or school account, and auth works just as you expect it to work. This is the other point I want to reiterate. You can build graph applications that make calls to different endpoints the same way for personal accounts as well as work and school accounts. It's really cool stuff. Jumping into beta, I can query for me/devices. And this will give me a list of the devices I'm currently logged into. And I scroll down here, I can see 3 computers that I have. The first, all the way down here, this is my workstation. So this is a desktop in my office. The next one is my personal computer. I see both of these are offline. I see that there's a Surface Book that's online, which happens to be the current computer I'm signed into. I can grab the ID here, copy that in, and then I can get just that device. Oops. And I can send it a command. So 1 second, let me fix this. So I can create a request to do something on this device. So using the REST API, I can specify that I want to launch a URI on this device that I'm signed into. And then I provide a payload, which in this case is a JSON object that contains more information about that URI. So I want to open one of my favorite websites, and that's graph.microsoft.com. It happens to be the same website I'm signed into right now. But when I run this query, it'll actually open the Graph website on this computer, even though this could be a computer that I'm not assigned into. In this case, it's the same computer. But when I run this, I give it a second, and it opens up graph.microsoft.com. It's really cool stuff. And to show you that I'm not just doing this client side. Tricking you. I can switch this out to bing.com. I can run that again, and this will go to bing.com. What's really cool about this is you can use it to do things like, if you have an application that plays video, you can send context from your phone to your desktop as you come home and keep that video playing. So you can build really continuous experiences across devices. So that's one of the really cool APIs available in beta. There's a couple other ones I want to show you. One is extensions. So every organization has a lot of data that's specific to their line of business. And this data often gets stored in a database. And that requires you to spin up a new database, set up the credentials, keep it in sync with Active Directory, for instance. So if you have something very specific about a user, such as your internal user ID or maybe their favorite color, anything like that, you have to set up a database and keep that in sync, and it's kind of a huge hassle. Instead, with Graph, you can extend that directly onto the user entity and persist it on our end. So you have all your data consolidated into one place. So I can query for me/extensions. I can see some, oops, I meant to do a query there. And what's funny is I actually wrote an extension when I just did that. When I made a post, I wrote a new extension called type launch URI, which was the payload to the other request. But here I can also see that persistent one called favorite color is green. And when I query the user back, I can even say, I want back maybe their ID and their favorite color. And I want to expand on extensions. And I get back, oops, not only the user, what am I doing? Oh, whoops. Not only the user, but also their extension. So I can use this to, when I fetch back the user, to get their favorite color and build solutions around that. So this is a really powerful way to keep your data in one place. If you have roaming settings, a great way to put those directly onto the data models that they represent.
So Dimitri, the service is actually, the aggregator service as part of the graph is aggregating data for you. So when you call into it, you can it's kind of traversing the graph for you and pulling things together. Is there a way to see that here in the Graph Explorer where you can kind of see how that's going on?
Yeah, there is. So this is one of the really cool things about Graph. I'll have to sign out for this because one of these requires, there are some things that require organizational accounts. In this case, I'm going to query something that's available from SharePoint. But I'm going to make a request where I'm going to ask for the user, and I'm going to ask for 2 things. I'm going to select their display name and their about me, which is a little bio of who that person is. And then I'm going to specify what if. And this is a declaration that I want to see what's actually happening under the hood. And here I see what the graph service is doing under the hood. So this is a cool way to sort of see what's happening behind the scenes. In this case, I see that's making 2 requests and merging back together the entity responses. In this case, it's making a request to an Active Directory API to get my display name, and it's making a request to a SharePoint API to get my About Me. And all that complexity is being handled by the service, not my application. That's one of the really powerful things about Graph. Jumping back to where we're working on.
And now if you can't see that, we know the font's a little smaller.
Yeah.
Go out right now. Go out to aka.ms/ge, and that'll take you directly to the Graph Explorer. We want to see all that traffic coming in. So go right now, check it out, and start the demo. Do those commands that we were showing you. Go back in the video, try the command out to see how the service is aggregating. You'll really start to see the power of the Graph and how not only performant it is, but how easy it is to use.
Thanks, Louis. So the other point I want to touch on is that Graph is growing. In the past year, we've seen a lot of new APIs come on, and we're seeing the momentum really continue. So we have cool APIs, like I just showed, the Project Roam APIs, query users sign in devices. We have, in beta, we have the ability to manage devices and set compliance policies at an enterprise scale with Intune, Teams APIs, organizational insights, like how much Skype for Business usage are we getting in our org. All that's available in beta. So we really encourage you to check out beta, see all the cool stuff that's coming in, and also look at our changelog and get a sense of exactly what's come in at a certain point. So I'm going to hand it back over to Louis, who's going to walk us through Azure Functions and how they complete the picture of how Graph and Azure Functions work together to build smarter business applications.
Great, thanks, Dimitri. So yeah, there's really cool stuff was going on in the Graph. I mean, essentially you have a single endpoint that you can call. You can get really rich sets of data, not only machine learning insights, but also information about any entity within the system and how they relate together using really easy tools. Dimitri showed you Graph Explorer, such a cool tool to be able to kind of go in and just try things out, experiment, create a really rich environment for you. Now let's get into the Azure Functions. Now, I encourage you to go check out all the other sessions about Azure Functions because it's just a really cool environment to work in. But what we want to go through is just give you a really high level and kind of work you through on how Graph kind of relates to it. So what is serverless? Now you've probably heard about Azure Functions and what serverless is. And essentially it's just allowing you to really worry about what's important. What's important to you as a developer is to build out the rich business logic, the rich secret sauce that you want to put in there. You really worry your time on what that logic does and how it works. Just like as Dimitri pointed out, using the SDKs and getting up and running really fast and really just worrying about your logic rather than worry about where you're getting the data and how you're going to get it and the different ways to different schemas, the different APIs and all that stuff is just really worrying about what's important. And this is really what Azure Functions is, and you'll see how that kind of marries really well with the Graph. And again, it's a way for you to distract servers away. So you're not worrying about infrastructure, where I'm hosting it, not worrying about the OS or the infrastructure that goes along with it or the platform. I'm just worrying about what I'm writing, how I'm writing it, where I'm getting my data, and what I'm doing with it. It's also about eventing. What I can do at a really instant scale. As the system kind of spins up and I'm running off events, whether it's webhooks or it's triggers like HTTP triggers, whatever I'm doing, I can do it off events. I can process data. I can compute things. I can run analysis just by using Azure Functions. And of course, there's also micro-billing. There's a sub-second billing. You only are billed for what you use. So the coolest thing about this is, you might have to spin up a big long server that kind of runs. Maybe it's co-located. It's kind of sitting out there. You're paying for it being there, no matter if you're using it or not. Really, the great thing about Azure Functions is you put your data in there, your business logic, and you run it. And for however long you compute, you basically pay for that. So that's kind of really the power of Azure Functions. And again, like I said, it's really kind of 3 things. So it's the ability to have triggers, events. So you're basically firing things and triggering Azure Functions to run its compute. But it's also the bindings, the data. So you have input bindings. You have the ability to automatically input data from different places. They allow you to declaratively define where your data is coming from in many different cases, whether it's queues or in this case, we're going to show you Graph and how we can get data from Graph really easily, and also output data. And we also do logic. So that essentially, it's the logic of the application that you're writing. So you can write very rich, complex workflows that can compute up to 10 minutes, and they really can be a rich environment for your workload. And you can almost build these kind of building blocks, domino kind of things, where you kind of build them together, Lego building blocks to essentially build them together and build out microservices. So really kind of a powerful thing. So we talked a little bit about, in the beginning, how we had a kind of a cron service, a timer service that kind of runs. Well, Azure Functions has this capability as well. It's ways of triggering the function. You can set it up to be a specific schedule. It can trigger and go pull out data from anywhere, whether it's using the bindings that we already have or calling into a separate service to do that. Again, maybe even calling into Graph to get your data. You could do things like cleaning, cleansing data. You can go and process the data, run analytics on it, pass it through a set of workloads or workflows. Really, whatever you want to do, the Azure function can do it. Again, declaratively, you can set up a set of bindings that can pull the data automatically, or you can write to a service that actually has your data. There's also event-driven. So like, for instance, whether it's a webhook trigger, it's from GitHub or from any other location that has webhooks, you can hook these things up to basically process and trigger a Azure function. And the key here is, now with Microsoft Graph bindings, we have this really great capability of binding to a set of events. In this case, a change to a workbook in Excel. We can trigger off that function when it's saved, and we can then go process that data. We can go and do analysis on it. We can create insights off of it. We can signal people whether based off that data. We could do a whole bunch of things that we can do that we couldn't do before, that when we didn't have those triggers and that capability of just writing business logic. And again, it lets you care about what you want to do. So if I wanted to go and experiment to figure out, hey, you know what? Just having a spreadsheet sit out there is not really doing it for me. I need to do something else with it. And this really gives you the power to do it. So again, what we talked about, parts of the function is just its triggers, its bindings, its input and output, and of course the logic. And it just really lets you kind of focus on what you want to do with the data. So if I wanted to go and experiment today, spinning up Azure Functions portal and just going in there and creating a really quick trigger function like an HTTP trigger and just writing code in there, building the demos that we did, it was really fast and easy for us to do that. And it didn't really require too much trouble. We didn't have to install Visual Studio if you didn't want to. You can, but you don't have to do that. So to kind of get up and running and experimenting. So like when do you really want to use functions? So there's lots of different, obviously, ways to do it. I'm not going to even pretend to try to give you all the different ways you could probably use functions. But again, a lot of times, like for instance, the example that I gave in the beginning, when email kind of off-peak times it goes down, on-peak times it goes up. So you want to be able to scale the service based off of whenever there's more events than not. And so that's really kind of when you have a bunch of sporadic load in your system, you want to be able to scale it in and out. And that's what Azure Functions lets you do. But also lets you data transform. So if you have really complex data transformations that you want to do, maybe it's aggregations from other places, maybe it's not, this is a way to do that. Also isolation, so you can do microservices, you can do building blocks, you can do piecing together, and again, each piece having really complex logic. So graph functions, we're going to show you a couple demos here and some of the code. We're going to get deep and dive in that. And this gives you the ability to, again, work off triggers just like mail. When a mail comes in, it's also based off of webhooks. We also have input bindings for when an Excel workbook changes. Also, there's input bindings for, kind of the key here is we also do input binding for providing auth as well. So you don't even have to worry about auth. That's kind of the key. In fact, one of the fastest ways to get up and running is Graph Explorer, obviously number one. But number two is just go over to Azure Functions and spin up a HTTP trigger for Graph using the Graph template, and bam, you're already up and running. You don't have to worry about auth. You don't have to worry about writing that code, and that's the key. So check it out, aka.ms/graph bindings, and you can see kind of the tutorials on that. And again, this is still preview beta, but Dimitri will show you in a little bit how to get that all set up and running. So again, Azure Functions, webhook. The big thing about webhooks is the fact that we can trigger, we can scale based off events, based off the off-peak times or on-peak times, the load, and it allows us to kind of do whatever we want, but also with this really unique way of binding the graph to that, it becomes a very powerful environment for us to write really unique and experiment with really unique things. So let's put this all together. And Dimitri's going to go through a really cool sample for you. And it's real centered around IT Pro, but it's really kind of a great example of how to get these two things married together. Dimitri?
Yep. Thanks, Louis. So in my sample, it's solving an IT problem. So Jane is an IT director for a large org, and she wants to make sure everyone's profiles are up to date. There's a lot of new employees that are missing profile information, missing their photos. So what Jane's trying to do is she's trying to find a way to let them know that they need to set their photo. And we can decompose this and solve this with those two technologies. So this calls for flexible architecture. It calls for being able to integrate into existing line of business applications, but not be tied down to specific implementations. So it's kind of decoupled, but it's really flexible, and you can really easily integrate into it from scripts, line of business applications, and more. And it's only run when Jane wants it to run. She doesn't want to pay for this to be running all the time because it doesn't make sense to run all the time. So it's really built at the interval that makes sense to her. And it works across different services in Microsoft 365. So we're combining together data from Active Directory, and we're using Exchange to communicate. So before, you'd have to integrate those separately. Now, with graph bindings, it's really simple to do it all in one step in an Azure function. So the tools we're going to use are going to be Graph Explorer for prototyping, the Graph SDKs to get nice idiomatic bindings for models, Visual Studio, or your browser of choice. So I'm going to hop in, and I'm going to show you my. I'm going to show you how to get started with the bindings for Microsoft Graph. So when you create a function app in Azure Portal, you can go down to Application Settings, and you can set this flag called Function Extension Version. And if you set this flag to beta, when you add a new function, you can see the templates that are called Microsoft Graph. And I'll be walking through the first one, which is the one I used for my sample. And Luis is going to walk through the other couple of those. I might have to do a refresh here. No problem. So I'm going to hop back to Connect 17, which is an app service. It's a function app. And then I'll be able to load up all my functions here. And then if I want to create a new function, it'll just spin up here. And if I go to scenario, I can say Microsoft Graph. And I see a couple of different templates that I can use. So I'm going to use the first one, which is a graph token binding template. In this case, all you're given is a token, and you just handle whatever logic you want to do. It's an HTTP trigger, so somebody has to hit that endpoint, but then auth is pretty much figured out for you. So my function is called fetch users, and I'm going to run it first, and then I'm going to walk through and step through the code. So this function, I think, is already running, so I can just get the function URL here and copy this out, and then I can paste it into a new window. Hopefully this goes. It's taking a minute.
Check Exchange.
Yeah, so I can, it might already be running, but just not showing up in Exchange, so I can just see if this is showing up here.
There it is.
There it is. So when I hit that URL, what it did was it went through, hit my function, did the logic I defined, and then sent out emails. And here I see that I got an email to myself. So it was sent from me, and it was sent to a couple people in BCC, such as Brian Johnson, to set their profile photos and instructed them how to do so. So I'm going to hop into Visual Studio and really walk through the code and show you how simple it is to get started. So here I have my project. I can make this a little bit bigger.
And this is just a standard HTTP triggered function?
That's right.
Cool.
Let me scale this up a little bit. OK, so the graph binding defines sort of the structure. So these are the parameters I'm passed in, and one of these is a graph token. So I already get a token up front, which is great because I can just use that and pass that into my graph client. I can initialize my client, and then I'm all up and running. I can make requests, really simple. And from there, I just do a little bit of simple logic. I create a recipient list, which is going to be the eventual list of people I'll send this out to. And then I have a couple try-catch blocks just to make sure that if I'm running into any issues, I can log it to console. Debugging is really simple with Azure Functions. You have a console integrated editor in the function portal itself. But here I'm using Visual Studio to make it a little bit easier to demo. And then I can iterate through users by making a request to users using the graph client. And you can basically walk the graph endpoints in the SDK and use objects. And you have a strongly typed object request builder pattern, so you can get back objects rather than JSON. And that's really powerful because you get IntelliSense. It's really good stuff. And here I iterate through each user and make sure that they're not a conference room or someone that doesn't have a given name. And then for each of those users, I make another request to fetch their photo. Here again, I use the Graph SDK. I specify their user ID to make a photo request. And if I run into an issue, if it hits the catch block, I know that that person is missing their profile photo, and I ran into a 404. So in this case, I want to add them as a recipient to my recipient list, and I'll send an email to them later. So here, I'm using the recipient object, and this is one of the objects that came from the Graph SDK. So this is an object model that represents what a recipient is in Graph. And then I create a new email. I specify the body, and I pass in the recipients into the BCC list. And from there, I make another request using the Graph client to send mail to that email, and then that's all I do. And it's as simple as that. I can get up and running in minutes and solve IT pro scenarios. And Lewis is going to come back and walk us through a more intricate scenario that uses the webhooks.
Thanks, Dimitri. Yeah, so this is a really good showcase of being able to show just how easy it is to kind of get up and running and be able to use those templates and those bindings that are already set up for you to kind of move forward and kind of experiment and get moving. And I think that's kind of the key, is being able to make you productive right away is kind of the major focus here. So the next kind of scenario we want to go through is it's kind of the Salesforce one that I gave you in the beginning. Is you have this Salesforce that's out in the wild, they might be traveling a lot, but they need to be able to communicate and handle correspondence that comes back from your customers. And you want to make sure you're readily available, either you or somebody on your sales team. And sometimes if you give out your business card, or if they give out their business card and they email directly and you're not available, let's say you don't have your phone with you. I don't know a salesperson that doesn't have their phone with them all the time, but just let's say they don't. Let's say maybe they're on a vacation, maybe they're out of the country and they're out of connectivity and they don't have that. So what's the best way to do that? Well, let's build a system that allows us to kind of trigger ourselves, trigger our other people on the sales team to be able to go and do something in order to make a better experience for our customers. So that's kind of the way what we're talking about, is just a way to signal our sales team. And essentially what we're going to do is the way we're going to decompose this thing is we really want to build it in Azure Functions. We want to be event driven. We want to be able to scale the service. I gave you that example, that story in the beginning about how we had to build this system where we had to think about how we're going to process every mailbox all the time, and no matter when, every so often spin up and go look inside and see if there's changes. Well, we don't want to do that. We want to make this more streamlined, easier to process, easier to scale. We want to make it event driven. We don't want any more polling services. We want to scale as we need, and so that's where we come in with the flexible architecture. So we also want to be able to work across many different Microsoft 365 services, and that's where the power of the graph is going to come in here. We're going to use that single endpoint for multiple points of data. We're going to pull in data from Exchange, both our email, our contacts. We're going to use extensions. Dimitri showed you a little bit about extensions. We're going to talk a little bit about schema extensions and how we're going to kind of expose more data from a contact that you've never had exposed before. And we're going to do that all just by using a single endpoint. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to go and have a trigger off a webhook that's basically anytime an email gets sent, it gets received in a specific person's email box. We're going to trigger a function using a webhook, and then we're going to go through a bunch of really complex workload logic that's going to happen here. We're going to go and we're going to get the information about the email. We're going to inspect it. We're going to get the from or the sender of that email. We're then going to go do a lookup. We're going to go find out if that customer's already being tracked in our system. If they're already a customer, they're already somebody that we care about, let's go find out. And so we're going to do a lookup of that customer. But then the key here is there's already some additional kind of really uniqueness about this. Is in the graph, we've used schema extensions. We've extended that contact within the system to now have tracking capability, whether it's tracked, it's ID, maybe that ID is from my third-party system, whether it's my CRM system or it's a third-party system that I'm using to kind of track customers and other data. Maybe that's already there. We will use that. We can pin it to this particular contact. It makes it really easy for us to just use a single endpoint to do that. And then once we have that information, we know they're tracked, we know it's a really important email, we'll send some signals out to our Salesforce, whether it's a separate email, whether it's a spreadsheet that they can go look at a report, whether it's it could be something else. Maybe you could use Twilio or something to send a text message. It could be really kind of a complex scenario, whatever you want to do. So Dimitri showed you a little bit about the Graph SDK, really powerful, really easy to use. We're going to show you some examples with that, and really how it's kind of an imperative way for you to basically build out your request. It's very close to the semantics of OData. Obviously, we have request builders. We have the ability for you to select the different attributes you really care about, filter on the different things you really care about, order by, and you can also expand on those navigational properties. So you can bring that all back as one particular message, and you'll be able to render it, and it'll all be deserialized in really unique object models for you to use. Again, you already saw kind of an example of that, and I'm not going to go through this, but we'll jump over to the demo really quick, and we'll start working through that. So I'm going to jump back into the Azure portal as Dimitri showed before, but this time I'm actually going to create a different binding. And the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to jump into Azure Functions, and what Dimitri showed you is what you'll notice here is that you do have other templates here, and there's actually three or four other templates. There's all of them are kind of related in one way, and the way they're related is they're actually webhooks, and they have the four different ones. Is the creator webhook, and what this does is you actually add this function to your function library here in your Azure Functions app. And what you can do is, no matter what principal that you're logged into, if they go to that endpoint, it will essentially register a webhook for you for Outlook for messages. And it kind of does all the work for you. It does the auth for you. It does the subscription kind of handshake with Outlook. It stores that subscription for you. It does all the work. All you have to do is add this function, and which is what I did here. I added an email webhook. If I go in here and just look at the logic, it's really simple logic. I don't even have to touch this code. In fact, all I would have to do is grab the URL function and run it in my browser, and immediately it will set up a subscription for me for my particular mailbox. In this case, I'm logged in as Megan B. So very simple way of doing that. And you'll want to make sure you add that creator. Now, in order to have the creator work, it has to have an endpoint that's listening for those webhooks. And so you have to add as well, before you actually run the creator, you want to add the handler to your Azure Function app as well. So you're going to click on the Azure Function handler, you're going to add that, and that's where the secret sauce goes. That's where your business logic goes, because that's what fires when the webhook fires. So you're going to put your logic in there. So once you add that, there's also two other ones. One is required, and I suggest you add it, is the refresher. And what this does is, essentially, if the subscription subsides, if it expires, and it does do that after a period of time, this will automatically go and do it. And in fact, it's kind of dogfooding itself. It's going in, it's using a cron service, a timer service that spins up behind the scenes, and it will go look at all the subscriptions, and if they're ready to expire, and it'll renew them for you. So you can keep those kind of webhook subscriptions alive. And then there's this final one. You don't have to add it. You should if you need to basically delete these subscriptions over time so they're not continually refreshing. And you'll add the deleter, and essentially you could just run that just using the URL of the function, and it will essentially go and remove the subscription for that webhook for you. So I went and already created these, so we don't have to wait for them to create. They're fairly fast when they do create, so you don't have to worry about that. But I added the handler, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio to kind of walk you through the code of what the handler is actually doing. So the first thing is, you'll notice I'm pulling in the Microsoft Graph SDK, and the way I'm doing that is not only I'm actually pulling that in the actual DLL, but also I'm also using the namespace Microsoft Graph. And what I get here is I'm immediately going to spin up a proxy, a graph client. And what I'm doing is I'm essentially passing in. Now I'm passing in the graph token, and the graph token is just like Dimitri said, is I'm getting this actually from the actual Azure function itself. So, and this is the same for pretty much all the code. So even this particular scenario. So I'm passing it in. I'm using that inside my graph client proxy. So the next thing here you'll notice is I'm actually going to make a call to graph. And what I'm going to do here is, the nice thing is I actually get a message object that gets passed into my function. So if I go look back at the function, you'll notice the first thing, the part of the schema of this is that I get a message object. And really what's happening here is when the webhook fires, all you really get is some little small information. You get the email ID, you get some information about the email, but very small amount of metadata around that email. But what the Azure function, what the binding actually does for you is it goes back to Exchange and it gets all the details about the message, and it passes you a hydrated message object for you to look at. It has all the content in there, the from, the sender, it does all the work, does the auth loop for you, so you don't have to do the work yourself. So once I have this message object, I can do some stuff with it. I can actually extract the user ID out of it, so I know what email box it came from. It can also now I want to go and say, okay, well now I know who the sender is, the from, so I'm going to go pull that, I'm going to parse that off the actual email, and I'm going to pass it into my separate function here, which actually lets me go and actually determine whether they're tracked or not. And the way I actually determine if they're tracked or not is I'm going to use a schema extension. And the way I do that is you'll notice that here's my query here, over here to the end. I'm going to kind of skip over here to this side. You notice I'm looking to the context resource. I'm filtering based off the email address that I got. That's the sender. And I'm selecting the ID, their display name, their email addresses. And then you notice this kind of interesting thing to the left here, to the right here. This is the schema extension that I added. I added what they call customer track data. And that track data can have a property bag of different data in there. What I added was essentially a tracking ID. So this way I know if they have that, they're being tracked. And they could have as many tracking IDs as I want. It could be many different third-party CRM systems. I just, at this point, just tracking one single ID. But at least I know if they have a tracking ID, I care about it because it's my contact and I care about it. So I'm going to go and make that request. I'm going to make a standard HTTP request. I get all the things that I'm already familiar with here, HTTP client. I'm going to do a send async on that thing, just directly using my graph client. I don't have to do any auth there. And notice that if I get a really good status back from that, I read and make sure that it's being tracked. And the way I do that is I just pull off the tracking customer ID. And if it's existent, then I pass back saying this is a tracked customer, and I return that back. So once I know that it's being tracked, I can pop back up to my main function here. I can say, okay, well now I know it's being tracked. So what do I need to do next? Well, next I need to do is I essentially need to signal the email. I need to make sure that it's being marked as tracked. So if I were to open my email, I say, oh, this has already been processed by the system. It's being tracked. So I'm going to go and actually do a send email or set email category. And by doing that, I can jump in here and I can actually view the logic I'm doing here. So what I'm doing next, again, I'm going to do another call to the graph. But this time, I'm just passing the user ID that I extracted from my original message, from the message context, and then I'm also grabbing the email ID because I want to basically do a patch and or update on that. And then the next thing you'll notice is the content of that is I'm just taking and marking the category. And what you'll notice here is I'm actually using the beta endpoint. Categories as part of Outlook right now is actually part of the beta, the preview endpoint. There should be part of the main V1 endpoint, but at this point you have to kind of switch over to using beta. Once you do that, you can essentially send in this content message to say whatever category you want. You can add an array of content categories if you want. I just use the email tracked one because I know it's a big red label that goes on your email. When you open it, whether it's an OA, it's a Mac Outlook, or if it's over in Windows or any of these kind of email clients, it will show the category and it will show it as tracked. So I went ahead and did that. And then I run the patch on it. And once I run the patch and I execute it, same exact code as I had before. I run the send async and it's successful. I know that, again, it's being marked as tracked. Now what you'll see here is I kind of have a little hand wave and I say you can do something else now. So once I know that the email is being marked as being tracked, I already figured out that it's in my email system. Now I can go do some really fancy things. I can send text messages. I can update a spreadsheet and do reporting. I can call into Excel. I can send another email if I want to, maybe to a shared mailbox, but this maybe has some metadata about how many times the customer has written in for the day, maybe some insights about what kind of interesting topics they might have. So this allows me to pretty much experiment and write really rich applications without really doing too much work. If we pop back over to the portal, what you'll notice in here is if I pop open this kind of side pane here, you'll notice that there's a couple files in here. There's my CSX file, my scripting file that I kind of pasted my code in there that it came from Visual Studio. But also I have my functions JSON file. And what this shows is the bindings that are available to me. So in this case, I'm actually using the input binding. It's an in binding direction. And again, this is the declarative way of defining your input and your output. In my case, I'm just using the input and I'm grabbing the message. So there's a binding behind the scenes that's going and actually using the ID that I got from the webhook. It's actually retrieving the actual message for me, and then I'm using that to pass it into my function. And then all I do is I give it a name, which is my this little guy message, and then I just put it as as part of my function schema here. And the key here is what you'll notice is this is automatically done for you. You don't have to do this yourself. This is essentially already set up, but you can add as many as you want. If you go to write your own bindings, you can essentially go and extend this and add more data that you can pass in. So it's kind of a key aspect extensibility story for this. And again, once you notice is the code is fairly the same here. The only difference is I didn't do a little hand waving that I did before where I had to get the graph token, but in this case, I'm actually having the graph token that's getting passed to me, so I can basically use that from the binding and run it. So if we go over to what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to say that Christy here is our customer, and she's going to send an email to Megan, who's the salesperson, and she wants to actually purchase more seats, and she wants to purchase 43 more seats, which could be a substantial amount of money. So we want to send that. And if we pop back over here, we pop up here, what we'll notice is we'll actually see the triggered function that once it triggers, there's a trigger function, a couple seconds in, and it's complete. And what you notice is I actually pasted the graph token in here so you can see that it's actually being given to me. Here's the user's ID mailbox that I extracted off of it. Now if I pop back over to Megan's mailbox, go back into the inbox, what you'll notice is there's Christy's email, and you notice, bam, it's marked as tracked. So I went and did a lookup of Christy. I noticed that she was a tracked customer, and I got to circle back and I actually marked her as tracked. So a very easy way, a very powerful way to write rich applications in just minutes to kind of get yourself up and running, just using very simple logic. So let's pop back over to slides. So Dimitri, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Sure. So to provide some next steps of what you can do with these two technologies we just showed, here's a couple ideas. So functions are really well suited to doing data transformations and doing things specific to your business. And then Graph is really powerful as a data provider. So a couple ideas of what you can do. You can fetch the context when a critical customer sends you an email. So this could leverage Lewis's code and do maybe an additional lookup of who that contact is, and maybe see if they've already ordered something, how much have they ordered, maybe set the priority to match, basically set the priority to match like the size or the impact the customer will have. You can orchestrate a lot of business processes, like the IT process. You can do things with critical Excel workbooks, do cleanup if needed, add new visualizations, pull in new data. You can transform images and other kind of blob formats. So you can make a mosaic of different images that are added to a OneDrive folder. You can have it triggered when things end up in that folder. So there's a lot you can do by mixing these two technologies. And it really focuses on what can you do to make your business process more powerful. Like the focus is thinking about solving your business problem, not worrying about the infrastructure, the differences between data sources, and just really focusing on adding value to your business.
Cool. So there's actually a question that kind of came up before we jump into who we are. Is in the Graph Explorer, is there IntelliSense? And so yes, there's a built-in IntelliSense. Sometimes I think the beta doesn't sometimes work, but you'll notice here is if I just type me, I get all the different resources that I can actually talk to. And as I start to build out my URL, I don't have to go and look up stuff. Now granted, we do have this really kind of cool thing to this left side that Dimitri showed where you can kind of go add your own samples and you can click on them and they will run, and you will see not only the request body, the content, but also the URL. But also you can just kind of play with it. You can just go in there, self-discover the different URL endpoints, the different resources that are available. Now, some of them you might have to actually figure out the different filtering and the selecting for it, but it's fairly straightforward. It's the standard OData syntax that you'd have when you're doing filtering and you're doing selecting and order by, that kind of thing. Really easy, kind of cool things.
Yeah, one of the other things I want to talk to is if you use the guided pre-canned queries to make requests like getting a user profile or their photo or their mail, on the right, there's a link to the documentation for that request. So if you try something out, you think it's interesting, you want more information, you just click here, and you get taken to our docs, and you have pretty in-depth reference about how to work with users in Graph, for instance. So there's really a wealth of documentation, and it's all unified in one place across all of Graph. And it really speaks to how unified the Graph developer experience is. So,
Great. Thanks. Well, that's all the content we had. I am Louis Maresco. I'm a principal engineering manager in the Office team. I'm all about Office extensibility and Graph SDK and extensibility there. So, reach out to me. I'm on Twitter at LouMM at any time, whether it's a feature, whether it's you have some questions about Graph, have some questions about Office extensibility, feel free to reach out to me. You can always check me out at twit.tv on my weekly show, Twiat, This Week in Enterprise Tech, where I do talk about enterprise stuff and our podcast. So check that out.
And I'm Dimitri, and I'm a PM on the Graph team, and I work on SDKs and the tooling. So I'm always interested in hearing more about your scenarios for Graph and figuring out how we can make your experience better. And you can find me on GitHub and Twitter at @dpim.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.